Before the Imperium conquered the stars, before the legions marched and the Primarchs became legends, spoken in half-whispers, across hive cities and blackened war zones, there was a night on Terra that almost no one remembers, and the few who do have been silenced forever. It is a night buried so deep beneath layers of statecraft, myth, and imperial decree that even the Ordo Malleus dares not reference it without trembling. But you, right now, are about to step into the shadows of a secret older than the Great Crusade itself, a truth that could unravel everything you think you know about the Emperor's grand design. This is the night when the Emperor met a visitor from the deepest strata of the warp, and struck a bargain he hoped no one would ever discover, a bargain so dangerous, so unthinkable that its consequences continue to bleed into the veins of the 41st millennium, like an infection that refuses to die. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you love diving into the forbidden corners of Warhammer lore, make sure you hit that like button so this video reaches more grimdark lore hunters like yourself. Our story begins long before the Imperium's banners flew across the galaxy. Terra was not yet the center of human power, but a wounded world, barely recovering from millennia of techno-barbarian warlords, red storms, and tribal devastation. Amid that chaos walked a figure completely out of place. A tall, calm man clothed in simple traveler's garb, moving through the irradiated fog with the deliberate silence of a god, pretending to be mortal. This was the Emperor, long before the world would kneel at his name. Yet even he, for all his unmatched psychic might, sensed something that chilled him to his core. Reality thinned. The air vibrated. A distortion opened like a tear in the fabric of existence, and out of that wound stepped a presence. Cloaked in shadows that did not merely hide its shape, they recoiled and twisted as if alive. This was no demon as humanity would later categorize them. It was older, deeper, a being that carried the faint echo of every warp god yet bowed to none fully. The Emperor's hand drifted toward his weapon, but the visitor's voice reached him first. Layered with countless tones, you seek to unify humanity, but you cannot do so alone. The Emperor realized this was not an attack. It was an invitation. But invitation to what? The creature, if it could even be called that, stepped closer, its footsteps leaving no trace in the ground. You intend to forge sons, it said, its voice shimmering between solemnity and mockery. Beings of great destiny, shapers of futures, champions of your cause, or instruments of your failure. The Emperor did not react outwardly, but internally he understood exactly what the entity referred to. The Primarchs, his greatest dream and most delicate project. The being continued, your knowledge is vast. Your will is iron, but the paths you wish to walk cross boundaries your science alone cannot touch. And if you do not seek our cooperation, your enemies will find their own way into your work. The Emperor considered this carefully. He knew the warp hungered for influence over humanity's future. He also knew the ruinous powers were not yet unified in attention. He had hoped to outrun them, to outthink them. But the being before him confirmed a grim truth. The warp already watched. Already waited, already planned. The Emperor lifted his blade, radiant with psychic strength. I do not bargain with chaos, he said. But the visitor only smiled, its form rippling like liquid shadow. This is not a bargain for servitude, it answered. We ask for no leash upon your sons, no corruption woven into their veins. Only a promise that when the moment comes, one of your children will choose us, freely. This statement sliced through the Emperor's defenses more sharply than any demonic claw. The idea of chaos demanding a choice rather than dominance unsettled him in ways he would never admit. But the being pressed on. We will not interfere with your work. We will not twist their birth. We will merely permit it. In return, you will allow fate and their own will to determine whether your line remains yours. The Emperor knew the truth. Beneath these words, humanity was evolving psychically at a rate that made it vulnerable. The Primarchs, when created, would resonate like beacons. If he did not secure this neutrality, chaos could sabotage the project entirely. A single flaw in a gene seed, a fractional psychic imbalance, a whisper at the wrong moment, any one of these could destroy everything. What the Emperor did next is the darkest secret of his early reign. He lowered his weapon. No words were spoken, no contract etched, but the creature bowed its head, understanding the silent acceptance. The Emperor justified it to himself as a strategic concession, a containment measure, a temporary allowance in the name of the greater good. But in that moment the warp bent, and the first seeds of the Horus heresy were planted, not by treachery, not by weakness, but by a calculated risk taken by the greatest human mind to ever exist. And it was a risk he knew he might one day regret. The creature dissolved into the air like smoke drawn into an unseen furnace. The tear in reality sealed shut. The storm winds returned. The Emperor stood alone again on the cold mountainside, but nothing around him felt the same. He sensed the Primarch project would now unfold along a path no longer entirely his to control. Yet he continued. He walked back toward the hidden laboratories beneath the Himalaya, carrying the weight of a secret he would never share. Not with Malkador, not with the custodians, not with his sons. Years later, when the Primarchs were mysteriously scattered across the galaxy, most of the Imperium would believe that chaos had forcibly stolen them away. Even now, that version of history is taught as fact across billions of worlds. But the truth, the one nearly no one living has ever known, is far more unsettling. The scattering was not an act of pure malice. It was the fulfillment of a condition. The warp had made its move, not to corrupt the Primarchs, but to shape the environments that would shape them. Worlds were chosen not because they would break the children, but because each world amplified some aspect of their nature. Ambition, loyalty, anger, pride, fear, compassion, or hunger for power. Chaos did not tamper with their souls. It simply gave each Primarch the stage upon which his destiny would be sculpted. And for one of them, that stage would lead him to a choice that would shake the Imperium forever. The Emperor knew the bargain had begun to unfold. He also knew there was no turning back. The galaxy would burn before the truth ever came to light. The Emperor locked this memory inside the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, in a chamber known only to a handful of custodians. He catalogued it personally, encoded it in his own psychic signature, and then commanded that no one, under any circumstances, should ever allow its contents to reach the light of day. Because the truth did not merely threaten the integrity of the Primarch narrative. It threatened the very legitimacy of the Imperium itself. What would humanity think if they learned their Emperor once bargained with a warp entity? How would the High Lords react knowing their godlike ruler had gambled with the fate of his own sons? And what chaos, true uncontrollable chaos, would erupt if the traitor Primarchs learned that the heresy was not merely their doing, but the consequence of the Emperor's own hidden decision? These questions haunt the Vault's guardians to this day. But we are only at the beginning of this saga. The forgotten truth behind the Emperor's bargain is a labyrinth of secrecy, sorrow, and cosmic consequence. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in those vaults where light seems afraid to linger, there exists a truth far heavier than any custodians. Golden armor, the scattering of the Primarchs, was not an act of war or even divine punishment. It was the moment the Emperor's silent bargain matured into something far more catastrophic. As the Primarch labs thrummed with psychic energy, the Emperor sensed a shift, subtle at first, then violent, destabilizing reality like a storm boiling from the inside out. Most Imperial records describe that moment as a sudden strike by the ruinous powers, an attack designed to sabotage humanity's greatest hope. But what those records omit is the hesitation. The warp did not tear into the labs blindly. It waited, probing, almost reverent, as if honoring the terms of a pact made long before any Primarch opened his eyes. Only when the Emperor turned his attention elsewhere, perhaps sensing the imbalance too late, did the warp surge forward, not to destroy the infants, but to transport them across the stars into the crucibles that would define them. And deep down, the Emperor understood this was not an assault. It was the price he had agreed to pay. Tubes ruptured, stasis fields collapsed, golden light gave way to warp-borne storms as each Primarch was pulled into a vortex tailored specifically for him. Leman Russ was hurled toward a world forged from harshness, discipline, and tribal loyalty. Vulkan was carried to a place of fire and compassion. Guilliman was delivered to a realm of order, structure, and ambition. Each destination was selected not at random, but with eerie precision, an almost surgical understanding of what would shape these children into the most potent expressions of themselves. The Emperor watched this impossible phenomenon unfold. Shackled by his own unspoken agreement, he could intervene against an attack, but not against a fulfillment. And so he endured, helpless, as his sons were scattered like burning stars across the galaxy. The silence afterward was deafening. Dozens of custodians rushed to his side, expecting outraged commands, perhaps even vengeance. Instead, they found the Emperor standing amid the ruins of his greatest hope, eyes distant, expression unreadable. as if calculating a million futures now shattered and rearranged. They did not know, could not know, that what had occurred was not theft, but the opening move of a game he had gambled on and already begun to lose. In the days that followed, the Emperor sealed the Primarch vaults, locking away every trace of the project and forbidding even Malcador from fully accessing the truth. Only he understood the complexities of what had just transpired. The Primarchs had not been corrupted, but they had been contextualized, shaped by environments, engineered to refine their strengths and expose their weaknesses. It was a calculated cruelty, a way of ensuring that each son's fate hinged on his own will rather than the Emperor's absolute control. And this was the critical detail. Chaos had not guaranteed a specific outcome. It had only ensured the possibility of free choice. This was the warp's loophole, its method of satisfying the bargain while giving fate room to twist like a knife. The Emperor knew he could still reclaim his sons. He could reunite humanity. He could build the Imperium. But now, everything depended on how each Primarch interpreted the galaxy that raised him. Would they trust him? Would they resent him? Would they worship, fear, or reject him? In that uncertainty lay the seeds of the Imperium's greatest triumph and its most devastating betrayal. When the Great Crusade began, the rediscovery of each Primarch became a spectacle of destiny unfolding. Each reunion reflected the unique impact of the world chosen for them. Rogel Dawn greeted the Emperor with unwavering loyalty forged through isolation and discipline. Sanguinius knelt with the grace of an angel destined for tragedy. Angron, brutalized and broken, raged against what he believed was abandonment. And then there was Horus, the first found, the brightest star, the one whose world had shaped him into a perfect balance of ambition, charisma, and vulnerability. The Emperor saw in Horus a son who represented what the Primarchs were meant to be, a being of limitless potential devoted to unity, forged in adversity that strengthened rather than corrupted. But what the Emperor did not see, what chaos had ensured he would not see, was the subtle imprint left on Horus by his upbringing, the need to be acknowledged, the desire to be trusted, the fear of being replaced. These were not flaws implanted by corruption. They were natural outcomes of the environment where he had grown, amplified by the psychic resonance that every Primarch unknowingly carried. Horus loved his father deeply, and that love would become the lever used to break him. As the crusade expanded, the Emperor began to withdraw from frontline leadership, focusing his attention on the secretive Webway project beneath Terra, a project he believed would free humanity from warp dependence forever. Yet this decision, rational as it might have been, became the pivot upon which chaos focused its attention. For Horus, raised to lead, this withdrawal felt like a test he was desperate to pass. For Fulgrim, it inflamed his pursuit of perfection. For Lorgar, it confirmed his belief that the Emperor should be worshipped, not merely obeyed. The warp observed all of this with patient amusement. It did not whisper lies, at least not at first. It simply allowed each Primarch's internal struggles to magnify until they eclipsed reason. The Emperor noticed these changes but assured himself that destiny could still be guided. He believed the bond between him and his sons was strong enough to weather the growing storms. He believed Horus, in particular, would understand the burden of leadership in his absence. But this was the fatal miscalculation, for the sun who shone brightest was also the one whose heart carried the deepest. Shadows. Shadows born not from corruption, but from the very circumstances chaos had curated. The final turning point came not through sorcery or possession, but through doubt, real human devastating doubt. When Horus was wounded on Davin, the warp saw its opportunity, not to seize him outright, but to present him with a choice framed perfectly to exploit his deepest fears. The visions shown to him were not illusions. They were possibilities, futures where the Emperor abandoned his sons, futures where the Imperium decayed, futures where humanity was enslaved by its own stagnation. Horus, desperate to protect the legacy he believed he was born to defend, interpreted these visions not as manipulations, but as revelations. He believed he was choosing a path that would save humanity from tyranny. That is the tragedy the Emperor never foresaw. Chaos did not force Horus to fall. Horus fell because he believed he was doing what his father would not. When he finally turned, the warp did not celebrate a victory of corruption. It celebrated the fulfillment of its bargain, the free choice of a son shaped perfectly to make the wrong decision for the right reasons. When the Emperor learned of Horus's betrayal, The devastation he felt was not merely strategic, but profoundly personal. He had gambled on the Primarchs' free will, believing their love for him would anchor their loyalty. He had underestimated the cost of allowing fate to sculpt their lives. He had overestimated his ability to control destiny, and most painfully, he realized this was the exact outcome the warp had engineered, not through deceit, but through the careful selection of circumstances guaranteed to test each Primarch's soul. The Emperor prepared for the heresy with the full knowledge that it was, in a tragic sense, his own doing. He waged war not just against traitors, but against the consequences of his ambition. As the Imperium fractured, as suns killed suns and the galaxy drowned in betrayal, the Emperor carried a secret no one else knew. The first domino had fallen not on Istvan, not on Davin, but on the night he accepted a bargain beneath a storm-darkened sky. The shattering of the Primarch project had been inevitable from the moment. He bowed his head in silence to a being cloaked in living shadow. As the Horus heresy raged across the galaxy, the Emperor understood with perfect, horrifying clarity that every step toward terror was the unfolding of the bargain he had tried so desperately to forget. The traitor fleets were not merely instruments of rebellion. They were manifestations of the consequences he had gambled on so long ago. Worlds loyal to him burned in solar flares or drowned beneath virus bombs. Legions that once marched in perfect synchrony now turned their weapons on their own. Brothers with a ferocity born of shattered trust. And while the Imperium reeled from betrayal, the Emperor felt the slow tightening of a noose woven by the warp. Not a trap designed to kill him, but one designed to force him to confront the one truth. He had buried deeper than the webway. He had allowed this possibility for the sake of creation, and now the bill had come due. In the silent hours before Terra was besieged, he locked himself in the chamber known as Archive Nullth and opened the sealed record he had written millennia earlier. The same confession, the same fear, the same acknowledgement that his greatest creations could also become his greatest undoing. The custodians stationed at the vault were forbidden to look inside, but they felt the psychic weight of their emperors, regret bleeding through the reinforced walls. They had fought beside him for centuries, yet none had ever sensed such profound grief, such measured acceptance of a fate he could no longer escape. When he finally emerged, the Emperor gave no speeches and issued no proclamations. He simply said, "Prepare the palace." Those 3 words carried the quiet gravity of the universe about to collapse inwards. As the traitor armada approached Terra, the Emperor knew there was no version of the future where this siege could be avoided. The warp had shaped Horus's path to this exact moment, not as destiny, but as the natural result of the Primarch's own convictions. The Emperor could not regret creating his sons. He loved them too fiercely, too completely. What he regretted was the silence, the secret, the arrogance that led him to believe. He alone could bear the weight of an infinite future. And now, for the first time in his near-immortal life, he felt the terror of knowing he might lose everything he had built because of one decision, made in a storm-racked night long forgotten. As the battle for Terra erupted, the palace's walls trembled under bombardments that split mountains and shattered continents. Titans clashed like gods warring beneath a dying sky. The air was thick with radiation, blood, and the burning ozone left behind by warp-born sorcery. Amid the chaos, one figure moved with purpose and inevitability. Horus, no longer the noble warmaster, but not yet the monstrous creature many portray him as. He was a hybrid of man and myth, a leader twisted not by possession but by belief. Belief that the Emperor had abandoned humanity's potential. Belief that a different path, though paved with war, offered a truer future. That was the cruel irony. Horus did not want to destroy the Emperor. He wanted to surpass him, to prove that the galaxy could be remade without the chains of secrecy, to justify the price he had already paid. And the Emperor, watching the city burn, knew that Horus's conviction came not from Chaos's lies, but from the experiences Chaos had curated. The warp merely nudged. Horus chose the fall. This realization carved deeper into the Emperor's heart than any blade could, because he recognized the tragedy. He had raised a son capable of reshaping the galaxy, just not the way he intended. When the Emperor teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit, he entered a reality twisted by Horus's psyche. The ship's corridors warped into impossible geometries, shaped by a mind torn between love rage, and the crushing pressure of divine expectation. At its center stood Horus, clad in blackened armor that pulsed with the energy of four gods watching from the shadows, not as masters, but as spectators of the final act of their long-running game. The conversation between father and son is rarely depicted with accuracy. It was not accusations and shouting. It was sorrow, bone-deep ancient sorrow. Horus pleaded with the Emperor to see the Imperium as he saw it. Rigid, suffocating, a golden cage masquerading as salvation. The Emperor pleaded with Horus to remember who he had been, to see through the illusions layered upon him. Neither truly heard the other. Both were speaking to ghosts, the ghosts of what they wished the other still was. In that moment, the Emperor realized the full price of the bargain. To allow free will meant accepting that even the greatest of his sons could choose to stand against him, and to preserve the future of humanity, he would have to destroy the child he loved most. The duel that followed was not merely physical, it unfolded across every plane of existence. Horus struck with the strength of a demigod fueled by conviction and chaos's encouragement, while the Emperor fought with the controlled despair of a parent forced to discipline a child who could never understand why. Energy storms ripped through the ship, tearing open fragments of timelines, memories, and futures. Horus showed the Emperor visions of an Imperium freed from oppression, a galaxy united not by decree but by purpose. The Emperor countered with visions of what chaos would do once unbound realities, where humanity dissolved into madness, where the warp feasted upon trillions of broken minds. Neither vision was wholly true, and that ambiguity made the fight even more tragic. In a moment of hesitation, one echoing the same hesitation, on the night of his bargain, the Emperor tried one last time to reach Horus. It was then that Horus struck a blow meant to kill. Only the sacrifice of a loyal custodian brought the Emperor a heartbeat of clarity. And in that heartbeat the Emperor understood. The bargain had run its course. The choice had been made. There was no redemption possible for Horus, not because he was irredeemable, but because the galaxy could not survive his conviction. The Emperor unleashed his full power, no longer constrained by hope or hesitation. The psychic blast annihilated Horus's soul so completely that even the dark gods recoiled. Retreating in fury rather than triumph, the War Master's body fell lifeless, armor cracking like a shattered monument to what he might have been. But victory came at a catastrophic cost. The Emperor's mortal form was ruined, his psychic essence shredded and burning. His life force flickered like a dying star. Loyalists hurried to his side, carrying him back to Terra, but even in his ruined state, he gave a final command. Place me upon the throne, not as a ruler, not as a god, but as a prison, a containment field to hold back the tides of the warp forever. As the golden throne locked him into eternal agony, the Emperor's final thought was not triumph or sorrow. It was the quiet acceptance that this fate was the consequence of his own silence. The Imperium he left behind would worship him as an infallible deity, never knowing the truth, that their god-emperor had once made a compromise that nearly doomed them all, and that compromise was the reason he could never speak again. In the millennia that followed, the truth of the Emperor's bargain became a whisper erased from every archive, every creed, every codex. The custodians who knew the truth guarded it with fanatical devotion, understanding that the Imperium could not endure such a revelation. For if humanity learned their Emperor had collaborated, even briefly, with a warp entity, worse, that he had gambled with the souls of his own sons, the foundations of faith would crack like fragile glass. Billions who prayed to his image would question everything. The High Lords would plunge the Imperium into civil war. The Inquisition would burn entire sectors to suppress the knowledge. And so Archive Null The remained sealed, its contents unchanged, its confession waiting unread for ages at a time. But there are rumors, reports buried beneath, censorship sigils that one custodian recently hesitated, during the centennial reading, that he walked away shaken, whispering, "We have misunderstood him for 10,000 years." Whether this truth will ever surface depends on the future. The Imperium is once again fractured. Rifts tear across the galaxy. Primarchs Marines march in the Emperor's name. Guilliman leads a crusade he never wanted. And somewhere beneath the palace, the file titled The Bargain waits for the moment when humanity is finally ready to face what truly shaped its destiny. If you want more content like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep explorations. into the darkest truths of the 40K universe.